Hello, I'm Tian Wei, and this is World Insight. Let's begin our program today with the latest on Afghanistan. On Monday, the United Nations convenes an international aid conference in Geneva to help shore up much-needed aid for Afghanistan. The UN called for more than $600 million in emergency funds to help tide over vulnerable Afghans facing famine and violence. After the Taliban announced the caretaker government last week, the top UN envoy to Afghanistan did appeal for uninterrupted aid to ease the dire humanitarian situation in that country. Food and jobs are harder to come by for many Afghans, forcing millions to seek refuge within and outside the nation's border. For its part, China has pledged some $31 million, that's about 200 million yuan worth of grain, winter supplies, and vaccines, medicines to the Afghanistan people. And that is promised by the Chinese side. The neighboring Pakistan has sent oil and other supplies to Kabul, while Russia plans to ship food and medicine. Meanwhile, we have also been hearing about Qatar, New Zealand, as well as the UAE sending in emergency supplies. So what more can the international community do to help Afghanistan? What about the results of the latest conference by the UN? Let's go to our correspondent first. ZMARYALAI ABASIN joining me from Kabul, our correspondent there. Mr. ABASIN, we understand the UN, for the latest information, already pledged $20 million for aid in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, several countries, as we announced earlier, have also been pledging to provide emergency aid. Now, how much would these kind of news be known to the common Afghans?
Hello and good evening. Well, Afghanistan in very much need to the international assistance in every aspect after the collapse of Kabul to Taliban. And then there was a humanitarian crisis already looming. More than 18.5 million people in Afghanistan needed assistance. Now, when the UN is already on the verge of assisting Afghanistan, there is much more needed. Do you hear me?
Yes, I could hear you very well. Mr. ABASIN, though, how much do this news that are coming from the international community for aid for the Afghan people, how much do they know to the real people on the ground? Mr. ABASIN, do we have difficulties hearing one another? All right, I'll talk to our correspondent later once our connection is better. For now, let me go to our panel for discussion. Joining me in the studio, we have Mr. Li Guofu, who is from the China Institute of International Studies. Sir, what a pleasure to see you. Thank you for being with us once again. Also joining us in Memphis from the U.S., Professor Joseph Gregory Mahoney from East China Normal University. Now he's living in the United States. So we hope later we'll also be joined by other panelists from different parts of the world. I want to start by talking about the latest information. As earlier indicated, $20 million coming from the United Nations announced by the Secretary General at the latest conference on aid to Afghans. Mr. Li, tell me more about what you think about that amount and also the international pledges for emergency aid to the Afghans.
I think, as you say, that 20 million and US dollars is not enough for the Afghan people, especially at this moment. And we know that, the situation in Afghanistan is very dire, and they are facing the winter, and also they are facing a severe drought or the famine. And almost half of the population need, especially the food, daily necessities, clean water, all these would come out from the outside. And so I personally believe and 200 million is not enough. They
Far
need
from
more.
enough. They need about the 600 million just to get by over the winter until sometimes next year. But Professor Mahoney, do you hear much from the U.S. side, since you are from there, about the real pledges and the real delivery of emergency aid to the Afghans?
I don't. You know, the pressure on the West will be high to help clean up the mess they're responsible substantially for making, especially the U.S. But there's also incredible pressure to disengage. One of the White House talking points is that the U.S. has spent enough in Afghanistan, both propping up the former government and fighting the Taliban. And now, of course, Biden is fighting with Congress just to get money to invest in the U.S. recovery. So it will be very difficult politically and perhaps impossible for the U.S. to now support a Taliban government financially. You know, perhaps the best we might hope for is that the U.S. doesn't try to block aid from the UN. But, you know, I think one really interesting and easy solution to this is if the U.S. could unfreeze some of Afghanistan's reserves and give those to the UN, and that can sort of wash their hands of the matter and not have to worry about funding a government that they were an enemy with or that they still designate as a foreign terrorist organization.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we are talking about today is not necessarily how to deal with that government. It is, after all, an interim government. It's not the formal government yet. And meanwhile, the humanitarian aid is for the Afghan people. Of course, how to deliver that to the Afghan people and to use on what projects needs to be closely monitored and needs to be sought out the channels. But it is not about that government. So I think there is a lot of mixed information, it seems, Professor Lee, that people are suggesting, what about the human rights issue? What about the interim government, the makeup of it? But now we're talking about the humanitarian issue. Politics is different from humanitarian issue, even though they could intertwine with one another, Professor Lee.
Yes, what you said is absolutely right, especially at this very crucial moment. And the people, and definitely would expect the Americans would have provided some aid, as our American guest has already said. If, you know, the Biden administration has some problems, maybe asking the Congress to give further financial aid to the Taliban governments. But we know that, you know, the American has frozen about 10 million Afghan money. That money belongs to the Afghan government, Afghan people. And if the American unfreeze of these monies, I personally believe that, you know, Afghan government or the people would have enough money, at least help them to be through the severe winter.
Now, this UN conference is not about giving the money to the Afghan government. It's about providing emergency aid to the United Nations, and through United Nations and various programs to get to the people of Afghanistan. Of course, some of it might have to be delivered by the interim government and its apparatus, but it's a very different thing. So we want to make sure that is well understood. Now, Professor Mahoney, we understand that China, Russia, Qatar, New Zealand, together with UAE and some of the other countries, either have already delivered some amount of emergency aid or have already pledged and in the process of delivering. So the question now is, we see such a dark contrast, shall we say, between these countries and the Western countries that used to occupy Afghanistan for the past 20 years. How shall we reconcile this huge difference?
Well, you know, you made the
Pakistan, I should also
that,
mention, it has also pledged, by the way. I should not forget Pakistan. It's very important that Pakistan, as a neighboring country, also has pledged and has delivered. Please go ahead, Professor.
Yeah, I think you made the point that it's important to distinguish between sort of the political and the humanitarian, and that this is an interim government. I'm reminded of the United States refusing to relax sanctions against Iran during the worst days of COVID, when people were dying, and there was no willingness either during the Trump or the Biden administration to relax those crushing sanctions to save human lives. So, you know, I think in the case of Afghanistan and the Taliban, the pressure is even more severe with European countries and the United States.
Right.
So I think that really what we're going to have to see is countries like the ones you noted, China, Pakistan, Russia, I think in the lead, but also Qatar, UAE, and New Zealand. I'm happy to see New Zealand in there as sort of the one sort of Western country that's willing to step forward. So I think that they're going to have to carry the weight and help save these people. The real problem, and you've also alluded to this, is once this aid starts landing, it can end up piling up. You do need some form of government, some form of distribution center to actually get this out to the people who need it. And to forestall refugee crises, starvation, and other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's why I also want to talk to our correspondent. I understand that now the line is okay. Mr. ABASIN, can you hear me now?
Hello again. There's a crucial need for the humanitarian assistance in Afghanistan. More than 18 million people already are living in a disastrous situation. Today, this morning, the UNHCR chief, Filippo Grandi, arrived into Kabul. On the other hand, the Pakistani airplane PIA have already brought some assistance in coordination with WFP and to the people of Afghanistan. It's a crucial time, and these aids are meaning too much. On the other hand, there is also necessary to observe the situation of the displaced people, a flood of the refugees to the neighboring countries, particularly Pakistan and Iran. So all these situations now need more focus as we hear the assistance from the UN and its different fractions.
We understand that both the head of ICRC and the UNHCR earlier already visited Kabul and Afghanistan. So they have already taken quite some information on what is really going on the ground. Mr. ABASIN, before you go, I do also want to ask you about the latest visits by the Qatari foreign minister in Kabul, and he has been talking about encourage the Taliban to engage with the international community and avoid isolation by preserving the hard-won gains of the Afghan people, for example, about women's issue and the girls' education. What more can you tell us about that, about some of the important visits by foreign dignitaries to Afghanistan now since the interim government was established?
Well, Qatar has been the very major ally to the Taliban, and they have been hosting intra-Afghan negotiation, also U.S.-Taliban negotiation, and they have had a very crucial role at repairing and resuming flights to Kabul airport, and they've been bringing assistance to Afghanistan. So they were the first high-ranking or high-profile officials that arrived to Kabul, and the first time met the acting Prime Minister of the Taliban, Mullah Muhammad Hassan Akhund, and the elites of the Taliban right at the presidential palace last night. And they discussed several issues, the humanitarian assistance, development programs, and also the inauguration ceremony for the interim government and the rest of the cabinet that needs to be completed. And also they discussed the inclusivity of the government with the Taliban, because Qataris has been really close to the Taliban. They've been close to the USA during all these 3 years of the peace process of Afghanistan. So there are much more expected from the Qataris, from the Taliban side, and the Qatar also pledged to assist the people of Afghanistan in different sectors, particularly the displaced people, in order to manage the administration issues and civil servant related issues in Afghanistan.
ZMARYALAI, ABASIN, as always, thank you. Be safe. Let me come back to our two guests in the studio, Mr. Li Guofu and Professor Joseph Gregory Mahoney. Earlier, we have already heard from the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, that if things are not being done, we are likely to see about almost close to more than 90% of the population in Afghanistan falling under the poverty line. And now it's about 72%. This is a gigantic number, one has to say. And the growth rate, the GDP of that country will be further slow down, and it's likely to be 3.6% to even 13.2% compared to earlier description of increase about 4%. Huge difference, Professor Mahoney.
That's right. You know, we are on the cusp of a catastrophe, and you know, we keep talking about all the problems that can come out of this. It's going to, you know, potentially open a door to a refugee crisis, which will destabilize neighboring countries. Starvation. It can lead to new fighting, new terror, and it has incredible implications for the health and well-being. But you know, the one topic that keeps getting crowded out of this discussion is, you know, what is the COVID situation in Afghanistan? We really have no data, no testing, no idea about vaccination. And I make this point because I remember several years ago I was talking to a former colleague at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, an epidemiologist who's responsible for the U.S. response to MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. And one of the things he conveyed to me is that one of the reasons that the world lost control of MERS is because of the civil war in Syria and the problems with ISIS. So, you know, that's a coronavirus. We're now dealing with COVID as a coronavirus. And we're struggling globally and regionally to get this under control.
Right.
And we're not even really talking about that because, you know, all the other crises are taking priority. So I think it's really incumbent for us to focus our energy on this particular area because
there's so many areas about Afghanistan we really need to focus. And the issue now is not about we know where we should focus on, but rather it's about how we can focus on that and who will provide the support and how much will that be. And we see that huge, shall I say, deficit of support as we've seen about the humanitarian aid to the Afghans compared to the cost of the war. Mr. Lee, I want to go to you also about the earlier numbers I raised about the UNDP assessment for the Afghan economy and also the poverty line. I mean, now it is a country, even though the political changes are already taking place, but it's a country that could hardly survive, it seems, Mr. Lee.
Yes, if there's no international aid, it will be very, very hard for the people, as UNDP has said. By the time of next year, the Afghanistan would reach what they called the universal poverty, as you know, almost 100%. They said 97 or 98% of the whole population will be under the poverty line. So here, you know, the assistance will be the priorities, and the Western countries, especially the U.S., should not, you know, to hold, you know, the Afghan people as a kind of leverage in order to pressurize Taliban government to make some concessions. And the priority we should focus is how to save the Afghan people, how to save the Afghanistan, you know, maybe, you know, the people, help them to go through the severe winter at the moment. That would be the most important issue.
Right. Don't those countries that have occupied Afghanistan for the past 20 years and beyond have the moral obligations to provide even minor support at this point? 600 million coming from the United Nations pledge. It's not a big number compared to the huge amount of money they spend on the war and the maintenance of the government that they helped to establish. Professor Mahoney, isn't there a strong moral obligation that's always there?
I think there is, but again, it's going to be very difficult for two reasons. One, the politics in the United States. Joe Biden is in a lot of danger politically right now. He's facing midterm elections next year. He's still fighting with Congress to get his infrastructure bill, which is really the key to him getting reelected, his party being reelected next year in the midterms. And again, his talking point has been we've spent enough. We spent trillions of dollars, and it was wasted. And I can't even get enough money to save ourselves now. So I don't see that happening. And that's why I raised sort of the novel solution, but I don't think anyone in Washington...
Mr. Professor Mahoney, I know it's not your thought, but I think it's a very interesting logic that we should really talk about that. I mean, when you think about the war over the past 20 years, hundreds of thousands of lives of the Afghans lost as a result of that war. Many are collateral damage. And it's because of the more than 2,000 lives lost in the United States as a result of the 9/11, sadly. And now we also see that
let's face it, the bottom line here...
It is the interest of the U.S. administration now for its own political future and its own election, and as a result, using the Afghan lives, the average Afghans, not providing even minor support. 600 million, not a big number. I have to say once again, think about the special forces, how much they would spend a day in Afghanistan. I mean, Professor, I really don't understand this. Can someone explain this in real logical terms?
Yeah, I can explain it.
Please.
I can explain it to you. You know, the bottom line is that the propaganda from the United States for years is that it went to Afghanistan to save the Afghan people and to save the Afghan women, you know, to save brown women from brown men. This is the old, you know, logic of imperialism that we've seen for a long time. This has never been about a humanitarian effort. This has been about the United States pushing itself into Central Asia, part of a number of different containment strategies, some of which are aimed at China. And, you know, as a result, now that this effort has come to an end, you expect that after 20 years of hurting these people, of feeding their own defense industries, of feeding their own military, that they're going to turn around and now give money to Afghanistan. It's absolutely... we're trying to imagine that there's some sort of morality or moral high ground in Washington, and there is absolutely none. So let's get to that reality and hope that others will step up and take care of these people.
It's a reality I could hardly ever be able to accept. Meanwhile, I know there are political realities, and there are also realities that people should remind others of, which is the lives of the average Afghans on the ground right now for the rest of the year. Professor Ian Begg is joining me right now from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Begg, we are in heated discussion about why 600 million coming from the UN. We haven't heard much from the developed economies to help the Afghans just for the rest of the year.
Well, I think it's worth... Well, first, hello, Tianwei. I'm very pleased to be speaking to you again. But I think it's important to put this in perspective. 600 million or 606 million spread among 38 million Afghans is $15 a head. That's about 2 or 3 days worth of living expenses, even in a very low-cost economy. We should also recognize that Afghanistan's GDP is of the order of 20 billion, but something like 40 to 45% of that has come through foreign aid, and if that foreign aid is turned off, that's 40% of 20 billion. 600 million comes nowhere near to that. So it's a problem on a different scale that has to be confronted.
Meanwhile, how do you see the efforts made by some countries, if we can take a look at some of the latest numbers? As we know, already UN Geneva Conference drums up an appeal for aid of $606 million. At this moment, we know China pledged $31 million of emergency relief with food, winter supplies, vaccines, and medicines. Last week, some neighboring countries, including Pakistan, for example, also sent cooking and medicine supplies to Kabul. On Monday, Russia announced the plans to send food and medicine to Afghanistan. So both short-term and the long-term, both everyday and emergency, all of these categories should be in the minds of many of us. If Afghanistan is not doing well, as we all know over the past 5 decades, there will be things that will have consequences for many others around the world, just as any other country is not doing well, and that will have ripple effects as well. Professor, once again, I want to come to you for your analysis. Professor Begg.
Well, there are several things going on. One is the loss of income, because the Americans and other Western countries ceased sending in aid that they were previously sending. A second phenomenon is that you have a new system of government, if we can call it that, coming in, which has no experience recently of running a country. They don't know how to run an economy. They don't know how to run a central bank. And they're going to struggle just to put the basics in place of administering a tax system, of administering an expenditure system. And we also know that Afghanistan is a country which is extremely poor. Its GDP is maybe, as I said, 20 billion, but when you spread that among the 38 billion residents, it's a very low income per capita. So it's a massive problem of poverty, to which we now have to add the problems of displacement of refugees, 3.5 million internally displaced, and the lack of mention of COVID that has to be dealt with. So there are huge economic problems there to confront. And that means that there is an incentive for the rest of the world to deal with this, because the consequence of massive problems inside Afghanistan is going to be huge pressure on two things: the heroin production and refugees, neither of which the rest of the world wants. So that says to me the rest of the world really needs to get its act together on a scale far greater than is now being talked about.
Before we go, we only have about 2 minutes, gentlemen. I know every one of you have some great points to share. Of course, a lot of debate about who will be able to deliver that. I mean, whether the so-called interim government established by the Taliban is trustworthy by the international community so that money will be pumped into Afghanistan for humanitarian aid. What do you make of that question mark, and what do you think could be the solutions to that? Professor Mahoney.
Well, I think, what we should hope for in the Taliban right now is, I think, what we're seeing, which is to try to foster positive relations with the countries that have already extended aid, most notably China and Pakistan, and to continue to make sincere overtures to Russia. I think they should do whatever they can to avoid regional conflicts, especially anything that would unhinge India and that might undermine relations with some of those who are helping them now. And, to try to take a humanitarian approach at home, especially with women and girls. Yeah. All
right, Professor Lee.
I think, the best thing at this very crucial moment is the international community, while, to encouraging, the Taliban to make a further reform to honor their pledges to the international community. But another very important thing is that, we maybe collected all maybe the money or the needed for the Afghanistan people, to help the people, to save the Afghan people.
But the thing, of course, is how is that is being delivered to the Afghan people. Professor Begg, what do you think?
Well, I'll finish with two things. The first is that the West, whatever you would define the West to be, wants certain things from the Taliban government. They want better treatment of women and so on. They don't want refugees. They don't want harboring of terrorists. The West has leverage because it has money, and it should use that money as leverage to try to persuade the new government in Afghanistan what to do. And I would say that maybe three-word finish sticks towards the Taliban.
Okay. Ian Begg, Joseph Gregory Mahoney, and Lee Guofu. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us and sharing your thoughts. Even though different perspectives, they're all very useful when it comes to building a consensus. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Stay tuned. We have more on our special focus with Afghanistan next. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The biggest refugee populations worldwide are mostly Afghans, some say, with more than 2.5 million registered refugees, of whom some 2.2 million are in Iran and Pakistan. Another 3.5 million people are internally displaced in Afghanistan, having fled their homes, searching for refuge within the country. With Afghanistan's rapidly deteriorating security situation, the number of people fleeing will likely to rise. I had the chance earlier to catch up with UNHCR Chief Filippo Grandi, and he has just made a visit to Afghanistan. Here's that exclusive conversation on the scope of humanitarian aid efforts in these troubled times. Tell me more about what kind of engagement are you having?
My organization, UNHCR, the United Nations Refugee Organization, is focusing a lot in Afghanistan on displaced people. These are like refugees in their own country. There are more than 4 million, 10% of the Afghan population, more than 10%, are displaced, are not in their homes. Over the years, they have been displaced by conflict, sometimes by natural disasters, sometimes to look for opportunities in big cities. This displacement has increased, and we must distribute food, relief items, shelter, medicine, everything that people need.
So what does that mean in terms of your interaction with the Taliban and the Taliban interim government, quote unquote?
We must interact with the de facto authorities because it depends on them how we can access the people in need. We are expanding. I think the situation is progressively, hopefully stabilizing. The Taliban has to give us security, essentially. And this is the main request that we have made. However, we have also raised other important issues. We need to distribute food to everybody, food or other items, non-food items, etc., to everybody. And we need also our women colleagues to be able to work in our operations. The Taliban want to run the schools there, right? Children must go to school. Girls have to go to school as well. So we are engaging on issues that are more straightforward, if you wish, and other that are more complex. But the dialogue is active and constructive.
Who are the immediate counterpart within the so-called Afghan interim government that UNHCR has to work with?
A lot of the interaction now is at a very local level. With whoever is in charge of a particular area. That's the way humanitarians work. This is not a recognition of the government. This is not for us. This is not for humanitarian agencies. This is a political issue. But we must interact with whoever controls a town, a province, an area to access the people in need. That's the way we work all over the world.
The chain of command, traditionally speaking, for the Taliban over the past 20 years may not be necessarily that clear, particularly at local level, which means demands coming from the central level of the Taliban may not necessarily be carried out immediately by the local level. What would that mean to your people?
This is, of course, I'll speak from experience here, many years working in fragile situations. This is very typical of transition periods, of periods of political uncertainty, and chains of command break down, and the new ones, the old ones, we don't know if they still exist. The new ones are not yet there. It's complex. And this is why we need to be very pragmatic, very opportunistic, where we have an opportunity to go and bring help to people, we do it. And guess what? We're doing it already. Not just UNHCR, the World Food Program, UNICEF, the World Health Organization. There is still a big COVID problem in Afghanistan. They have shipped medical supplies from Pakistan. Pakistan has been very helpful in allowing us, to bring people and goods. So it's a big effort, and we really need the help of the international community because in these uncertain situations, operations are expensive. We will call on the international community, all countries, including China, to help us in this important effort. At the moment, the biggest priority is to deliver fast, substantive aid to people in need inside Afghanistan, especially the displaced people. We need to stabilize the situation inside. There will be big issues coming up very quickly. Who pays the salaries in the schools, in the hospitals? Who allows the state to function? The big development assistance has been suspended. So those are big discussions that are coming up, and I don't have answers. It's not my responsibility other than humanitarian, but I'm telling the international community, focus quickly on those issues, because if you neglect them, the humanitarian crisis will increase, and then you have big flows of people that may get out of the country. Then we need, of course, in that situation to help the neighboring countries receive large numbers of refugees. We haven't seen it yet, but this is something that we need to try to avoid by helping more inside Afghanistan. May I add one point? It's important also that the international community helps us pass some key messages to the de facto Taliban authorities, especially in terms of respecting people's rights, respecting women's rights, allowing girls to go to school, allowing women to work. These are important milestones that Afghanistan has gone through, and we don't want to go backwards.
Welcome back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Let's move on to China's Macao Special Administrative Region. Macao announced that the preliminary results of the election of the 7th Legislative Assembly early Monday morning. The election kicked off on Sunday. The results show the 14 candidates won the directly elected seats and 12 won the indirectly elected seats. In line with the Basic Law, the new legislature is composed of 33 seats, including 14 directly elected seats, 12 indirectly elected seats, and 7 others who will be appointed by the SAR's chief executive. The 4-year term of the office will start in October. The Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office of the State Council in China has congratulated the Special Administrative Region on successfully holding the election. How did the election carry out the principle of patriots governing Macau? And what will the new Legislative Assembly bring for Macau's residents? Let's ask our panelists. Lam Yikafong, so wonderful to have you finally in the program. What do you make of the results? Since we only have about 2.5 minutes left in this program, what do you make of the results this time?
I think the result is a bit kind of unexpected. I think that now we have more and maybe like the majority, they're going to be candidates from the traditional association resent. And so then it's kind of expected, but I think that people did not expect that the ratio of this pro-establishment will be that big. And so then we call the non-pro-establishment is a bit smaller. But I think it's still kind of fair because now with the new laws here, and so then now we have all those patriot or patriotic candidates here. And so they are more or less from the same kind of color shown, yeah.
All right. Another question, very briefly. I understand the economy in Macau is also under the pressure of the pandemic because Macau has been focusing on tourism. How do you see the election results and those that are in the public office will be able to help to solve some of the biggest problems that people in Macau are facing, particularly when it comes to income and the uncertain future as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think that the government did try to, we had a kind of voucher scheme last year and this year, and so we gave people like 5,000 to spend, and so this is some instant help for those people that are kind of in shortage of cash. And at the same time, we here in Macau, we also the government actually they conduct different classes.
I see.
With subsidy to the people that take the class and help them to raise their skill in a certain area.
Okay.
And that's what they've been doing, yeah. And this is try to train them to be, somewhat professional, prepare them for some other jobs in the future.
Thank you very much. Anis Lam Ik Fong, coming from Macau, really appreciate it. Thank you.